Good morning. I'm Dan Tupper, District 3 Commissioner and President of the Board. This is a special meeting of the Jefferson County PUD Board of Commissioners. It is Tuesday, August 10th, 2021. It is 10 a.m. By the direction of the PUD Board of Commissioners and in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, Jefferson County PUD is no longer providing an in-person room for meetings of the BOC. All meetings will be held remotely via Zoom. Participant audio will be muted upon entry. Please unmute at the appropriate time to speak. If you're calling in, use *6 to mute and unmute and *9 to raise your hand if you want to request to speak. With that, since we've called to order, I'll move on to the agenda review. If I could get the introduction of commissioners to confirm a quorum for the audio.
Okay.
Kenneth Collins, Commissioner, District 2.
I see Commissioner Randall's on here now. Maybe his audio is not functioning yet.
I'm good. I just have a computer glitch. Thanks for waiting.
All right, thanks, Jeff. So we have a full board. Quorum is confirmed. Are there any additions or corrections to the audio, or excuse me, to the agenda?
No.
Not seeing any heads in the, okay, all right. We will go ahead and I'll ask for a motion to approve the agenda as provided today.
So moved.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. Any other discussion on the agenda? All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. So welcome back to Scott Sims, PPC Executive Director, and PPC staff. Do Kevin or Joel, do you want to do any other type of introduction or lay out how the presentation is going to go before we turn it over to Scott?
Do you want me to?
Yeah, I was.
If you want.
Go ahead, Joel. I was. They've been here before. I was just going to turn it over to Scott, but you can introduce them, Joel.
Well, let me have the honors to turn it over to Scott. This is the continuation of the last presentation, and I think we all just really appreciate the time and attention that you guys have spent providing us this personal briefing. And rather than listen to me, I think we'd all rather listen to you all. So thank you.
Well, thanks for the nice introduction. And I would just say, kudos back to you all, because we love it when our members engage us and want to talk some more about the issues at hand. I mean, we have obviously our monthly meetings at the Public Power Council, and with a couple hundred folks on the phone and a pretty tight agenda, there's only limited room for diving deeper into the issues. And as all of you know, running a utility, the issues are only becoming more complex, and it's important to take that time, the right time necessary to invest in what's happening, that not only that the background of how we got to today, but also what's happening right now and what we think will be happening in the future. So in just a few moments, I'll turn things over to our staff here. We've got Michael Dean, Policy Director here for PPC, Lauren Tenney-Dennison, Director of, how do we say it, Lauren? Is it Markets and Grid Strategy? I always get them all flipped around. Is that close enough? And Mike Lynn, who's a senior analyst for us. And Mike is a newer addition to the team, but has been just doing a phenomenal job of quantifying sometimes the unquantifiable, which has been extremely important in getting down to the data and analysis that drive decisions and ultimately drive policy formation. So they're a part of our team. We last time had walked through with the Jefferson team some background about who we are at PPC and what we're up to. And I would just say, again, the shortcut, excuse me, is that we are really about the Bonneville system, and folks who get either a part or all of their power and transmission services from Bonneville. We basically cover every issue under that umbrella. And last time we spent with Jefferson County PUD, we had such a great conversation. We didn't get through all the presentation, which is why we're having part 2 today, which is perfect. We'd rather have the appropriate time lent to each topic than cruise through them too quickly and have people scratching their heads at the end. So what we really focused on was the competitiveness elements that we really try to really, hone our attention to in the bondable system. And when we talk about competitiveness, we don't mean competitiveness at all costs. We mean preserving the value and ultimately sustaining the long-term viability of the federal system upon which many utilities in Northwest, like Jefferson PUD, rely upon for, again, all or a portion of their power and transmission services. We talked at the last time a lot about the statutes and the drivers behind the way BPA was created, the unique creature that it is, the contracts, some of the statutory elements. And we really focused on those areas where the portfolio around competitiveness that deal with costs. And so the two pieces that we really focus on at PPC are the cost elements, really trying to control those, making sure that they're prudent, making sure that they're appropriate. But the other side that's becoming more and more important that we're going to have Lauren and Mike dive into a little bit more detail today is the revenue opportunity side. So essentially that revenue element that helps offset the cost side. And there's really some intriguing and important developments that are happening across the West with regards to the marketplace and the opportunities to position the federal system to get the maximum value out of that surplus power while also reducing the risk exposure to us for things like governance and other issues that are extremely important that, again, we'll walk through in just a moment. So if that sounds good to the board, what we'll do is we'll have a brief, a little bit deeper dive, a couple things that have developed that we want to make sure to address on the contracts and rates side. Specifically, Michael Dean will talk about borrowing authority and our approach to borrowing authority. I think that was a question that came up in the midst, that we can kind of do some quick cleanup on any of the things that were sort of overhanging from the last meeting, and then we can go forward and dive into the market's dynamic, if that sounds good to folks. So I'll just pause to see. I know it's kind of a mouthful for an introduction, but see if that's generally what folks would like to hear today.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. It's Commissioner Tupper. I don't see anyone from the public on at this point. So do you want to go ahead and after you get through your initial brief here, start with us taking questions as you go with each section, or would you wait till each presentation is completely done before we chime in?
I think what we could do, why don't we try this, Dan, because I think it's been, I think, really excellent to have your all input and questions and feedback along the way. And if we do get joined by the public along the way, that'll be great. It's always good to engage with the public on a lot of these pretty heady issues. So why don't we do this? Why don't we jump in with Michael Dean doing a kind of a quick recap of a couple of key elements on the sort of the background and the current standing, if you will, of the bread and butter elements of the bondable portfolio. A couple of things we wanted to address proactively up front. We can pause and see if there are any questions off of that, and then we can pivot over to Lauren, who can kick us off on markets work, give us some of the summaries, and I bet there will be some questions along the way, which is perfectly appropriate. And there is the raise your hand function or the chat function, so, or you could just speak up verbally, and we're happy to take those as we go, if that works.
Yeah, it sounds good to me, Scott. And you have the ability to share screen. I'm assuming you want to share screen today. Was Will touch base with you on that or not? Or
Mike, did we want to pull it up from our side? I wasn't sure if we'd shared with Will.
Yeah, I think Lauren was going to pull up the slides since she'll be doing, I think, a lot of the presenting here.
Okay, take it away, guys. Unless there's anything else from the commissioners, go ahead and take it away.
Okay, thank you so much. And again, we really appreciate, again, the handshake here and also the informalness. I know I called you Dan instead of Commissioner Topper. I'm a little rusty sometimes on that. So, but it sounds like it's okay to call you by first names today. I
prefer that.
Okay.
Yes, I'm fine. Thank you.
Excellent. All right, take it away, Mike.
Yeah, Lauren, do you mind going? I think it's to slide 33, just that rate case slide. Oh, perfect. Yeah, so wanted to just start briefly. Obviously, we discussed this at the last PPC board meeting, but when we had visited you all recently, the conclusion to the BP 22 rate case for those rates that are going to affect in October was still not quite there. And what we had characterized then as this proposed settlement, as it's described here, has now been finalized. Adopted by the administrator in the final record of decision in that rate case. The average decrease in wholesale power rates did end up at the low end of that range that we had presented to you earlier, 2.5% average decrease. Looking at some numbers here, I believe it's always a little interesting comparing which baseline you want to use, but it should be apples to apples from what how BPA characterized in their final proposal. Jefferson should see approximately a 3.4% decrease, so a bit more than average. And in addition, some analysis PPC did on specifically the incremental impact of the settlement. It's about an additional 1.1% compared to the initial proposal. In other words, all preference customers essentially were significantly better off under the settlement than they would have been under the policies proposed in the BPA initial filing. And that 1.1% there is about equivalent to $152,000 annually of benefit for Jefferson in power rates for the upcoming rate period. So we think that was a good outcome from the case. There's obviously a few things that, like any settlement, that were not perfect from all parties' perspectives, but overall, achieving a power rate decrease at a time when a lot of communities and utilities are digging out financially from some impacts of the last 18 months. We thought that was a win that we really needed to do our best to get, and we're really gratified to be able to get there. And it's a product of bringing public power together and working through different opinions and ultimately coming up with one voice where the executive committee was able to unanimously support the settlement, the final version of the settlement, after some discussion and debate on approach leading up to that, but ultimately public power coming together. So that we did want to close that out, since this had been, like I said, proposed rather than final. One other item just to keep updated, or two other items I'll say before I turn it over to Lauren. We did discuss a little bit of our post 2028 issues and work plan, but did just want to highlight we have a lot of touch points on post 2028 product and contract development here between our technical rates and contracts group. Obviously, executive committee. We have a subcommittee of the executive committee meeting in the interim to provide guidance and feedback for staff, along with some opportunities for general managers and executive staff to have discussion, working towards some white papers on issues, laying out background and options that I think will be a nice shared resource amongst public power as we move on later in the year. And then we also held our first educational webinar on sort of the background and foundations of FCRPS, BPA power supply, and potential alternative options. So if you didn't get a chance to attend that first one, it is something we have available. So just shoot an email to me and or Karen, and you'll see some notes in the future on that. And then lastly, before turning it over to Lauren, I believe we got a question that Joel, you relayed from, I believe it was Commissioner Randall, on, what is the value proposition around the potential extra borrowing authority expansion that is contemplated in the legislature the infrastructure package that just went through the Senate and is now up for consideration by the House. So borrowing authority is an issue that it's a tricky one. It can be a little bit two-sided, but it is one where we do see a fair amount of value. BPA has, they don't really have the ability to access a lot of public markets for capital. They obviously can't raise equity, and they have limited ability to raise debt to finance long-term capital projects. And given the aging system, we're seeing a lot of need for investment on both the power side, but then especially the transmission side as well. And that really led to one of the key issues in this rate case where, BPA is saying that they are not going to be able to access the amount of capital they needed for long-term investments in the system, leading them to adopt a lot of revenue financing of capital investments through rates, basically paying upfront for long-lived assets. And that created quite a bit of upward rate pressure in the near term. So from our perspective, debt is really just it's a financing mechanism. What really matters is the value of the underlying assets and are they being invested in prudently. So that is something we work a lot on at PPC, obviously, monitoring and providing input to BPA on their asset management plans. They made a lot of progress there, especially on the power side. Still some work to go on the transmission side. But from our view, the need for investment is really clear. And we see the expansion of borrowing authority as a tool to be able to facilitate that investment in a way that does not unduly burden current customers for investments that could last 20, 30, 40, even 50 years. So the other piece of that is, again, debt is a financing decision. As I said, the quality of the assets that are being invested in that really matter. That said, there needs to be an appropriate balance of financing sources. We don't want to necessarily debt finance 100% of assets. We want to have the correct leverage ratio or debt to asset ratio. BPA has a policy in place for that, wherein even though they have access to this additional borrowing authority, they're not going to increase their leverage through time. In fact, the power side of the business has been progressively deleveraging for a number of years. Transmission is holding constant there, even as they're expanding their asset base for needed improvements and system expansion. So all in all, if the borrowing authority, we see it as a tool in the toolbox, and it can have value as a low cost source of financing, but that's got to come in conjunction with appropriate controls on what's being invested in, making sure BPA is managing the business prudently. And we're really happy with some of the associated language that got included in the legislation that's going to put some controls around that in addition to what we already have in place. So hopefully that answers the question there. It's not an issue of BPA, financing ongoing operations with debt, buying the groceries on the credit card, as the saying is, and not paying it off every month. It's really a tool to prudently invest in long-term assets that are going to provide value over many years, subject to the right oversight and transparency. So we don't see it as something that will affect BPA's financial viability in a negative way. Quite the opposite. It's a tool to give the agency what they need long term to make the right investments.
So we had a question from Dan and then Jeff, Mike.
Go ahead and let Jeff. Yeah, let's go ahead and let Jeff follow up on that, and then I'll come back in around after Jeff had his follow up.
Okay. Thanks, Dan. And I don't know if you're going to get to it. It's from the slide deck that you gave us last time, but it shows the percentage of how BPA spends $1 of its revenue. And it's got, and I found this on their website too, 24 cents of so 24% of their money is spent on operation and maintenance of the hydro projects and the Columbia Generating Station. So 24% on O&M of just running their facilities that make their power. And another 24% is spent on principal and interest of federal and non-federal debt. So, that seems pretty significant that the debt and interest they're already paying equals their operating costs on the part of their business that makes the power that they can then sell. So it sounds like, you've explained your understanding of what they're proposing to do with this additional debt opportunity, and that there are some internal limits, policy limits that they have in place. I guess maybe you could just address a little bit this issue of where they currently are and whether that seems to be of concern to you or not, that they're spending an equal amount on debt coverage as they do on operating their facilities. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. So to me, it's not a concern in and of itself. To me, the picture overall is, is the power competitive? Is it affordable relative to the alternatives? And I think it clearly is at this point. There's obviously challenges that we need to address on an ongoing basis. The fact that it happens to be equal debt service versus O&M is probably just a peculiarity of the hydro system in general, being an extremely capital intensive, sort of high fixed cost resource relative to, say, you could have, for example, a gas turbine that might have extremely low debt service, but extremely high variable cost due to the cost of the fuel, say, for example. So to me, the fact that they have a high debt load, high fixed cost, maybe would be a better way to put it, is just a function of the resource itself, and not necessarily a cause for concern in and of itself. Again, looked at as a package with, like you said, making sure that those other policies are in place, such that we're not dramatically increasing leverage over time. It's actually the opposite for power in particular, that's going down. So yeah, we see the leverage is decreasing. We think they're making prudent investments in the assets on the hydro side. So from our perspective, we don't see a cause for concern, but again, it's a case of making sure we have that ongoing transparency and accountability.
Okay, and I guess there's another way to say it too, and it's the focus on, and you've said it multiple times, there's two ways for BPA to be more competitive. One is to cut costs, one is to increase revenue. And it sounds like this is going to help in at least the short term, because they needed to raise money, and their only way to raise money was basically to put it in savings through rates and then spend it on investments. It's basically raise revenue through rates and immediately spend it and invest it. And this way they've got money coming in through borrowed money that they can invest instead, and they don't have to immediately do it through rates. But at the same time, I'm thinking, well, if you're taking on more debt, that's more debt payments eventually, and you're gonna have to, again, raise revenue or decrease your expenses in order to make those increased debt payments. So
and I just see it. I think Mike had said, earlier, it is one of the tools in the toolbox, and we don't. It's funny. Borrowing authority comes and goes. Our longtime lobbyist Marty Canner, who's been with us at PPC for 30 years, will tell you that we don't always get a chance to have a bite at the apple for the borrowing authority. So it really does become that part about the prudency and holding Bonneville accountable to its financial objectives and making sure that we have some really good oversight. We also, in the proposal, as Mike was saying, we got some really great sideboards that were added that add some additional protection. First of all, it's not a here you go, here's your checkbook, have fun with it. It does come in two tranches, at least in the Senate proposal, and it is important to note that we haven't gone to the House yet, so we'll see what happens. But I would very much look at it as, especially in such a complex operation, just an additional tool in the toolbox, but not one that we would say tomorrow or overnight would love to see them exercise the $6 billion that's allowed before 2028 and the $4 billion after. I mean, I think we're going to be really heavy on the prudency side. The important part will be, if you look at the ratings agencies' reviews of Bonneville, I always find those to be so helpful in looking at any company, because they're basically just straight up with, here are the pluses and here are the minuses, right? You've probably seen it, sort of their consumer report style of showing where they think a company is distressed or where it's got its opportunities. And certainly on the Bonneville side, you always see continued high ratings for not only its contracts with customers, which gives it a sort of guaranteed supply of revenue, but it also does hint at and suggest that with the portfolio it has, especially with some of these mounting climate concerns and, of course, changing legislative environment that you all have seen in Washington and we've seen in Oregon, and we're seeing it play out across the country. And of course, just the IPCC coming out yesterday with grave concerns about climate change and issues. The Bonneville portfolio is one that's so unique that I think there are, of course, such great merits. So the idea would be, how can you, again, we'll talk about this in a minute, because it does fit right in with what Lauren's going to say. how can you maximize those revenue opportunities to start chipping away at not only stabilizing rates, but chipping away at your debt profile. And as Mike says, we have seen some great gains here in recent years on its managing its debt. And so I think this is a good tool to have in the toolbox, because the last thing you want to do is have those high performing assets get out of the maintenance cycle, right? This is what we always try to tell our kids about maintaining cars and those kind of things: is stay up on the maintenance, or you're going to really have the asset depreciate quickly. And that's really what we want to make sure to do, is stay ahead of those asset needs, so we can invest in the system and keep it running really well.
Hey, Scott, could you say that rating agency again? I didn't hear you said it was.
I just said the ratings agencies in general. So
Yeah. Okay.
if you go into BPA's website, bpa.gov, and there's an investor page, they typically have, or investor section, they typically have the latest posted ratings agencies reports from Fitch, from Moody's, from S&P, that provide kind of a straight up shot of where things are with regard to their concern level, and also where things are in terms of the plus side that they see out of the company. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, you bet.
Yeah, and maybe just add on to maybe close out on that. But Moody, all three major agencies did affirm BPA at high investment grade levels in May and June earlier this year, with a stable outlook. So BPA is credit is rated higher than the IOUs in the region, whether it's PSE, PAC, or PGE. So they're in a very strong financial position based on the actions they've taken to deleverage. So it's a question of just maintaining that balance through time of having the financing tool, not getting to a point where maintaining that control over leverage, prudent investment. And at the end of the day, the cost of capital for that debt is really low. It can be 3-4% for 20, 30, 40, even 50-year bonds, relative to what the cost might be. Like you said, Jeff, if that money's coming out of ratepayers' pockets right away, they could be putting that to work in their communities, making investments in their businesses or other pieces. So that's sort of the opportunity cost to weigh on the other side. So that's the balance we try to keep an eye on, making sure that ratepayers of different generations are paying fairly for the assets that they benefit from. Not making sure BPA is not in a situation where they're too leveraged, where they're financially vulnerable to unexpected events, and then also at the same time taking advantage where we can of some relatively low cost debt to finance those long-term assets. So there's not a single right answer, but those are the factors that we work to balance in our advocacy.
And for fun, if you want to look at some of the ratings agencies reports for some of the utilities out there that are really struggling, as we mentioned earlier about coal plants, Hawaii Electric has 60% of its power coming from fossil fuel. I mean, they actually have reciprocating engines burning, fuel oil to make electricity in Hawaii, one of the highest price, utilities in the country. There's some pretty great, comparable analyst reports out there on some of the utilities that are positioned pretty poorly given the way things are evolving. So.
Anyway, so hopefully that helps, but it's definitely gonna be an ongoing conversation as well. So it's definitely not a one and done there.
And then Dan had a question, I think, too.
So thanks, Mike. When you started your presentation there with this, what's on the screen, the screenshot here, you talked about a number. And since we record our audios and people come in and listen, I like to qualify when we get certain numbers out there. And you threw that $152,000 benefit to Jefferson PUD out there. Could you maybe flesh that out a little bit as to how you came to that calculation? And does it take into anything account, like if they institute the spill surcharge again and, other, things that could affect what our actual return would be on that rate decrease?
Yeah, that's a great point, Dan. And I should have qualified that a little more. So what that number I just quoted there was, that's the benefit we were able to calculate based on BPA adopting the settlement versus what they had in their initial proposal. So basically, by adopting the settlement, there's that much less upward rate pressure, or conversely, additional wholesale rate savings for Jefferson in the upcoming rate period. There is a chance that that could be attenuated by rate adjustment mechanisms. That looks very unlikely for at least the first year of the rate period, but could have an issue. There could be a crack or some other type of surcharge needed in the second year of the rate period. Again, not looking likely at this point. The other key, of course, that's obviously just one piece of the financial puzzle for the utility, and we know that each utility is in a different financial circumstance. A lot of utilities have reserve funds to replenish, other investments to make. So how that money flows through to any individual utilities, retail rate structure is totally variable and depends on the circumstances at the utility. So that'd be the other sort of framing that probably could have done up front.
And you used one other term there. I believe it's an acronym. You said crack. Could you define what you mean when you say crack so that people that are listening understand that term?
Yeah, absolutely. And if we had glad you guys don't have an acronym jar, because I probably would have ended up putting a lot of dollars in there at some point. But that is a cost. Yeah, BPA has their base rates, but then they also have some different mechanisms where those can be adjusted up or down if there's significantly different financial results than were anticipated when the rates were set. And the crack is a cost recovery adjustment clause, and it's a mechanism to be able to raise rates in between rate cases in the instance where there's some really adverse financial circumstances that arise because of market events or something else. But yeah, in terms of the analysis, probability wise, seeing very low chance of those events occurring coming up here, but of course circumstances can change.
Thanks.
Well, that was everything I wanted to, I think that Scott and I wanted to cover. And then unless there's any questions right now, I think we wanted to hand it over to Lauren and Mike to dive into some of the market's questions.
All right, great, thanks. Well, I'll kick things off, and then Mike Lynn will be chiming in on a lot of this. And just to let you know, we're working with a slide deck where there's a few updates from the last set of slides we shared, so we can share these after the presentation. But last time we heard that you were interested in having some discussion on the CAISO wheel through issue, so we added a little bit in there about that. So some new slides there. So how we'll run through this, we've got a little bit of context up front, just what is a market, why would anybody participate? Then we'll jump into a little bit on CAISO and their role in the market, why we talk about CAISO so much. Then Mike will talk about the wheel through issue. We've been discussing quite a bit at our executive committee meetings. And then we've got quite a few slides about BPA's EIM participation. So like you've been doing so far, please jump in with questions as we go if they come up. So I think we hit on this slide last time very quickly, but just as a, what is an organized market? Well, in economic terms, electricity is really just a commodity, at least as you talk about it from a market sense. Any electron is like any other electron. And so the organized market is simply designed to match the amount of supply that you have for the amount of demand, and having it done through an organized market allows more information, matching about what the bid is, what is available, what is the price to what people are willing to pay. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through this presentation. But just to note, in an organized market, generate the dispatch of resources is centralized. So one entity is deciding how the resources participating are dispatched to meet the need, as opposed to a bilateral situation where I think, last time briefly mentioned that you're calling up and checking in with individuals, making one-on-one deals for how you're going to meet your power supply. And just to note, if you're in an organized market, there's not a path to follow. The generation serving my load is coming from X resource. If it's served from the market, it's served from a pool, versus again, the bilateral, exactly which resource or group of resources is serving your load. So those are some of the distinctions there. To quick hit on, so why would anybody participate in an organized market? We wanted to break this out a little bit from the regional perspective and an individual entity perspective. And part of the reason for doing this is there's been a lot of discussion recently about regional studies on potential benefits of markets, looking at what we're going to West-wide, what might be some of the opportunities there. And we just wanted to note that there might be some distinctions between what is what you see regionally in some of these studies and what individuals can expect. So one of the reasons you might, from a regional perspective, why we see so many, particularly right now, we see a lot of states interested in having entities join organized markets, is that they're intended to reduce inefficiencies through centralized dispatch. So the entity that's doing the dispatch has more complete information. They can see which resources are the least cost and make it so that those are actually the facilities that run to meet the need. As opposed to, again, in the bilateral context, it's based on contractual agreements. You might have the least cost resources. You might end up with some pretty expensive resources. It just depends on what agreements are in place. So really focused on, and conceptually, the market is focused on reducing those inefficiencies. There's also a reduction of the transactional costs. So in a bilateral market, the generator that is the least cost or would be best to serve the load might not have the transmission that it needs to serve that load. There might be barriers from I own a lot of transmission on this path that, to get to Portland or to get to Seattle. And so I can use my resource even though it's not the least cost to serve it. Those types of things, when you get into an organized market, and we'll talk about the different designs that you can have in an organized market, but one of the major points of having that organized market is to reduce those types of transactional barriers. And I'll pause there. I see Commissioner Collins has a question.
Yeah, thank you. Lauren, have organized markets been around for a considerable period of time in the United States? What are some examples that have been drawn upon in terms of thinking about this particular market?
Yeah, maybe I'll go to this slide just because it has this picture here shows some of the organized markets across the U.S. and the North America. And really, when you look at it, you've got the South there that's a bit of a holdout, and the West that's a bit of a holdout, aside from California, as far as retaining that bilateral function. We'll talk in a little bit about the difference between an EIM or a day ahead or a full-blown RTO. All of these organized markets here, these independent system operators, they function as RTOs. So they are offering basically all of the operations planning. You can see here the things that we talk about, the California independent system operator providing. Those are provided by the RTO in all of these scenarios. But when we talk about something like the EIM, where really it's just a day ahead market that is focused on an imbalance energy only, and I'll kind of jump ahead. Mike Lynn has been using this analogy, which I think is really great. It's the EIM is the gravy on top of everything else. It's a very small amount of the market that is impacted by the EIM versus these other independent system operators are. Really, it's everything in the market, from centralized planning, centralized operation. You'll notice, so these are all consolidated balancing areas. So reliability is, that's all centralized. The EIM is a little bit different because it allows the participants to retain a lot of those responsibilities. And so that is a bit of a newer idea and leads to some of the challenges and some of the tension that we see between regions through that process, which will come up when we talk about the wheeling issue for sure.
following up on, what Lauren was describing too, and you can see in the map that most of the ISOs and RTOs are out east. Most of those have been in place since like the mid 2000s. So there is a good amount of history there. It's also what I would consider kind of the standard internationally. So there's also quite a bit of, benchmarking and international approaches to these type of markets. You can see in the US, at least the West is just kind of the last adopter, and that's for, a whole variety of reasons. But there, like nationally, at least, there's a pretty extensive history and use of these types of markets.
Yeah, and just to add on to that too, it's there's a lot of interest, especially from FERC, to see these type of markets grow throughout America, the Northwest, or North America as a whole. So there is a lot of pressure, I think, on the Northwest and the West in general to start exploring a larger, more expansive, more inclusive market. Like Mike said, it's pretty much the standard, and FERC is very interested in seeing that continue across the North America. Okay, unless there's any other follow-ups on that. Great. So one of the other reasons that you might want to have a market form, and you'll see that those markets have pretty big footprints, the larger footprint you're dispatching over, you get to, and if anybody's been tracking the RA program, they talk a lot, they use this phrase about unlocking the diversity of the program and unlocking the diversity benefits. If you have a bigger footprint, you're able to capture more of the, hey, in the Northwest, it's not hot today, it's really hot in California. You can kind of balance out if it's, in the wintertime, if it's colder in the Northwest and not in California, the resources can come back up this direction. Through having a larger footprint, you're really able to capture more of those benefits. And that's especially important when you get to the point where you're integrating a lot more variable resources. So the larger footprint, sun, we're looking at if the sun's shining or the wind's blowing. If you have a bigger footprint, those resources will be on and off at different times versus, right now, if we talk about BPAs, the wind is heavily in the gorge. So when the wind is blowing heavily, you're getting, all those wind resources are on at once, or they're off all at the same time. So that's part of the benefit as well. I'll see if Mike wants to add anything there.
No, I think that's right. And Lauren will get a little bit into this on the next slide too, but of particular importance to, like, from a Northwest perspective, when you think about the benefits of a market, is they're generally quoted in what's called production cost savings. So that is how much less fuel can we spend to meet the same amount of demand. And if you think about a hydro generator essentially being able to displace a gas generator somewhere else, how those savings are split between the gas generator and the hydro resource become of particular importance to the Northwest specifically. And I know Lauren's next slide gets into this a little bit more.
So then rolling into, so why would you be interested from an individual entity perspective? And, as Scott and Mike Dean mentioned, we're talking here about both actually potential to lower costs and to create additional revenue when you look at like BPA participating in the market. So the market can allow access to less expensive generation than what's in the current portfolio. So when BPA did its study on participating in the EIM, a lot of the benefits that they noted were from purchasing solar generation from California in the middle of the day when California is basically in a generation surplus and needs somewhere for that generation to go. Bonneville would be able to then purchase that at a very low cost and then reserve hydro for generation later when prices would be higher. So that's why somebody like BPA might be interested from a cost perspective. Additionally, they'd be interested because there's opportunity for additional dispatches. So BPA can then use their resources, bid into the market, and potentially make additional sales compared to what they would be selling without participation in the EIM. All of these, the ability to execute on these and actually realize benefits are heavily dependent on both the design of the market and the way that the entity participates. It's also going to differ based on the type of resources that each entity has. And so there's a lot of variability here, but that's sort of the why. And I see Commissioner Topper has a question.
So when you form a market or go into a market, there could be multiple balancing authorities within that region. In the particular instance of EIM, does CAISO become the overall balancing authority, or does BPA doesn't, do they give away any of their autonomy there?
That's a great question. So that is one of the differences between a like a full-blown RTO, regional transmission organization, and the EIM. In the EIM, each balancing area retains their authority and over their own balancing area. That's not how it traditionally works, but that is how it has been developed in the EIM. They also retain the authority over their transmission, how their transmission is used in the market. That has been a really important issue in the past when there's been discussions on potential expansion of some of these larger markets into the Northwest. That's been a huge issue that has been really hard to work through. You know, access to transmission, price of transmission. And so the way that the EIM has dealt with that is each participating entity retains, you know, they stay their own balancing authority area. They're in charge of the reliability within their balancing authority area. And then it's up to that entity for how transmission is made available to the EIM for dispatches. We have this slide. I'm maybe sorry to be kind of skipping around here, but I think this slide goes through a little bit of that. So as it's laid out, that's one of the reasons that like the EIM it's a lower risk, but also lower benefit compared to other market designs, because you're really just looking at only a small amount of transactions. And I should have had a bullet in here too that captured that point you just made, Commissioner Topper, on they're retaining their own balancing authority area, retaining control of their transmission. There's a lot of functions that stay within each participating entity at that point. Versus if you look down at the bottom of this slide, when you get into the RTO, so just in your example, would CAISO be the balancing authority area? That would only really happen if they move, as a region, there was a movement to go forward towards a RTO where then all of the balancing authority areas would be consolidated. I see Commissioner Randall's hand up.
I think Ken might have been up before me. I'm not sure.
Oh, I should have asked. I thought that might have still been up from before.
Okay. So my question is, how do these ISOs, independent system operators, get set up? And I'm just imagining, as you talk about some of the barriers that we have in the Northwest, is the issue of transmission, that it's not available to everybody. How are they set up? And is it possible we could ever have one in, including Washington?
Yeah, and I'll have to admit, I don't know the history of how all the different RTOs, if we go back to this, how they were all set up. I think that there have been different paths to creation for multiple of these entities. But on your question on could we have one in the Northwest? Could Washington be part of one? Yes, I think that some folks have indicated quite a bit of interest for that to happen. What would need to happen, I think, would be just that there's a critical mass of entities interested in that. And I think, those discussions, there have been attempts in the past, multiple attempts that maybe even folks on this call have been part of various efforts in the Northwest, because there's been quite a few. And so it's really the attempts that in the Northwest that have gone in the past is utilities working together, talking about, what the design could look like, what things need to be included. And I think the path in the future for a potential RTO would be something similar. And so it would have to be, critical mass of folks interested, or perhaps even, there's been quite a few states where either the legislature or the public utility commissions have ordered the investor-owned utilities to look at participating in organized markets. That just happened in Colorado recently, and I think Nevada as well. And so there's, whether due to their own interest or because they've been directed to, utilities might choose to go forward and start developing those things, or join a already formed market. There are some folks, I mentioned Colorado, there are some utilities there that are looking at joining the Southwest Power Pool. You can see the footprint, the purple there, they are currently participating in a energy imbalance market in the Colorado area or in the Mountain West area, very similar to the EIM. And many of those entities have signed on and said, we want to look at expanding this day ahead market, or the energy imbalance services, into an RTO. And so there's a few different paths there. I will say that I think I've heard folks interested in multiple paths, in the Northwest, potentially at this time looking at, various things. There's been interest in the day ahead market, which would be sort of another incremental step between the energy imbalance market and the full RTO. The RA program is being stood up by the Northwest Power Pool, the resource adequacy program that is. And in a recent FERC technical conference on resource adequacy, many participants there were talking about the potential to expand that program into something more eventually. So I think generally the Northwest seems more comfortable with taking these incremental steps, building something and building on top of it. And that seems like that would probably be the path to an organized market, a larger organized market for the Northwest. But there's a few different discussions going on in that arena.
Well, if I could just follow up on that, it seems like one of the things that might be a barrier is the huge discrepancy in utility costs, where you've got a Chelan PUD or Grant PUD might be at 3 cents a kilowatt hour. And then you've got investor-owned utilities that are, 2 to 3 or 4 times that, of why would the cheap ones want to join? And then another thought is, well, if transmission is one of the big barriers we have, is there a way to somehow make the transmission more accessible? But anyway, I don't need to dive down this rabbit hole further if it's taken us off course.
And those are good questions too. And I was just going to say, to the origination element, there's usually a legislative and regulatory, as Lauren was indicating, usually a pretty heavy legislative and or regulatory body interface, and sometimes multi-state, sort of conjoined legislators, right, with some sort of a governor leadership, or a footprint that starts small and grows bigger, which is what we're certainly seeing in the SPP model. But you're right, there are always those equity issues. But the good news is we've got a lot of market precursors ahead of us that have dealt with that very same thing, of a mix of public power and private, and people who have resources or don't. So those things, are luckily we're not the front end of it. And I just gonna say one other, I think, interesting point is that we used to have a problem talking about markets in the Northwest. We'd get up near the edge and it would be scary to people. The good news is I think people have fully appreciated now that, as Lauren was indicating, FERC policy really is pointing toward more market activity, not less. And just the world around us, we're more comfortable talking about it now. The question really becomes how to construct it in the right manner with regard to the Northwest. So at least we're over that hump.
Yeah, and just to add on a little bit more there too, Commissioner Randall, you mentioned the difference in generation costs. It sounds like I'm hitting on transmission again, but one of the big issues has been the difference in transmission costs too. Because in an organized market, you start to blend those costs. BPA has very low generation costs and transmission costs. And, especially when we look at BPA's transmission system, that would be a large part of whatever market would form in the Northwest. And so But when you start blending it with, PAC's, Pacific Core's transmission rate, some of the other entities that have much higher transmission rates, it starts to get very challenging from that perspective. I'll also mention that another challenge that I think we'll have to work through as a region if this moves forward is carbon, because each state will have different, at least as it's moving forward right now, each state has its own carbon policies. And that's even been a challenge with the EIM and having California have its own carbon policies. They're still trying to figure out, especially, there's been discussions about moving the CAISO market from not just an EIM real time, but into the day ahead. And especially with Washington, some of the legislation passed by Washington, one of the big issues is, well, how would you deal with carbon pricing or, carbon requirements? How would people be able to indicate what they need? Because if we go back to this very first slide, sort of the idea that in economic terms, it's a commodity. Every megawatt is like every other megawatt. Well, that starts to not really be the case if different states have different expectations or requirements around carbon. So that'll be another challenge to work through, which is interesting because markets are often looked at as one of the best ways to incorporate renewables because of those diversity benefits that we talked about earlier. But at the same time, so the desire for green energy can be a driver for these, but it also creates a challenge as far as implementation when there's not one rule across the footprint there. And apologize for, Commissioner Toper.
Yeah, I just wanted to say we're at the 1 hour mark. So I'm assuming we're going on a 2 hour hard line. So just if you guys want to let us know where you need to be here, go ahead and do it.
Yeah, that's great. And I think if you guys are okay with us jumping around a little bit, I think this is a great opportunity to have question and answer. And I think we'll be able to cover what we wanted to cover today. And mostly it's what you all are interested in hearing. So from my perspective, this is perfect, but you guys let us know too if there's you want to keep it moving. So we talked about some of the benefits, and we've talked a little bit about some of the concern with organized markets, but just to hit on these from a regional perspective, poorly designed markets can create additional risks, both economic and operational. We saw last summer, there were quite a few organized markets that had issues, right? SPP, well, that was actually a winter issue. ERCOT had significant issues last winter, CAISO last summer. And so there's just like any another, the bilateral market has risks too. One of the things with a organized market is just if there is poor market design that's baked in, it's a little bit more pervasive over a bigger footprint. It can also be a little bit more challenging to dig out what's happening. That's something that, Mike Lynn has been our expert at digging into what happened last year in California and looking into some of the really interesting dynamics last year when there were emergency alerts in the CAISO BAA. But it takes a really special skill set to do some of that. And it can get complicated very quickly. There's also increased volatility for most participating in the market. Again, this can depend on the design. There's some ways that you can participate in the market and remove yourself from that volatility. But just volatility can sound negative, but it's both upwards and downwards. I don't know if you all were able to participate in our members forum that we had last week on risk. One of my favorite quotes from that was from Kevin Nort that said, risk is like gravity. It's there. You can't just ignore it. So I think it's, how you want to engage with that risk. I just mentioned that to say that, we talk about risk here. It's not necessarily negative. That upward risk is part of what creates benefits in the market too. From an individual entity perspective, what some of the risks are, we talked about, the regional benefit, and a lot of these studies that have been done to support some of these programs are done on a regional basis, but the amount that each entity benefits, and I think this gets to Commissioner Randall's question, really depends on how they're situated. They might be getting huge amounts of benefits. They might not actually benefit. even if the region as a whole benefits. So that's something to remember. And then the elements of the market design are really important here too. And maybe I'll just pause there and see, Mike, did you want to add in anything on, market design in particular?
The only thing I would add is, Lauren had shown the graph earlier about most of the ISOs and RTOs are concentrated in the East. And if you think about sharing regional benefits, if you have a system that is predominantly thermal, it doesn't create the same kind of equity concerns that it could in the West, where you have a resource like a hydro, which the variable costs aren't really necessarily the cost of the fuel, etc. So it sets us up where the way that prices are set in the market and the specific design elements can lead to, drastically different outcomes for somebody that has a large hydro portfolio. So specific market design and price formation elements are something that we're paying particularly close attention to as these conversations about regionalizations of markets in the West are becoming more prevalent.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And I'll just add or highlight this last bullet before we move on. Oh, I'm sorry, Commissioner Topper. Sorry, the hands pop up. The videos move for me very quickly. So sorry, I'm like surprised every time.
Thanks, Mike and Lauren. So with the selling of the EIM to, all the different entities, for someone like us who's, tier one preference customers, part of the second point is we're going to pass savings through rates to people like us, entities like us. Is there any other benefits that to particular utilities in our position that we should be aware of or thinking about, or conversely, is there any real negatives that we should be prepared for if things don't quite work out? Because I know there's an exit strategy once they get into the market, but that doesn't help in the interim when you have to make up for those differences.
Yeah, I would say that, with BPA in particular, and we've probably sounded like a broken record on this at the executive committee meetings, the way that BPA is participating, at least in BP for the 22 rate case, which covers 2022 and 2023, there are zero net benefits from participation included. At the same time, Mike was just talking earlier about the crack. BPA does have risk mechanisms that if things go well and BPA makes a bunch of money in the EIM, that would go to reserves. If things go poorly and they lose a bunch of money, it could be possible that the crack could trigger and customers could see impacts in their 22-23 rates. So just to add in there that, I think a huge influence on how you, even if we're just talking about that first piece, how is it passed through rates? A huge amount of that is what BPA actually does with its rate design and how they choose to pass through those costs and benefits onto customers. And that's something we've been really pushing on, and we're really pushing BPA to have a process and make a commitment in advance of BP 24 to have a rate design that would include those benefits in the rates. As far as other benefits, there are some benefits from on the transmission side so transmission costs are included in your power costs, even though you're not a direct transmission customer. If there's the ability to avoid, BPA has said that they expect that it wouldn't be large builds that would be avoided from EIM participation, but modest changes that they'd have to make to the system to allow additional flows. Some of the centralized dispatch expected in the EIM might mitigate and make it so that they don't have to make those investments. BPA has also touted their grid mod process, which I'm not sure if you could say this was part of the EIM or not. BPA said they would do it anyway, but a lot of it was driven by EIM participation. And that is supposed to lead to additional visibility and analysis and a knowledge of what's going on in their system, and theoretically should allow them to market better, schedule better, basically improve both their power and transmission side of the business. Regionally, there's also some considerations. We were just talking about that discussion about how do markets form. One of the things that BPA has talked quite a bit about is the importance of being at the table and participating in this market, getting experience so that they would be at the table if there is a discussion about expansion into a larger market. I think, for you as a BPA customer, how important or beneficial that is really depends on how responsive BPA is and how open and transparent and what kind of communication is going on with you all as that process happens. And that is something that we have been pushing a lot on as well, really pushing them to be strategic as they participate in any larger discussions. And we will be asking them to add on to their strategic plan to specifically address how markets fit in there. And so it could be, BPA's participation could be really beneficial in that area, but it's kind of contingent on how they go about that and what specifically happens there. I'm probably missing something, so I'll look at Mike and Scott and see if there's anything that. Okay. All right, thanks. And then Commissioner Collins.
Yes, Lauren, could you please explain what's meant by upward and downward risk?
Yeah, so going into the market, the prices are, as opposed to locking in a bilateral deal where what you're going to pay for the product you're going to pay, as long as the deal goes on. If you're participating in the market, there could be the opportunity that you're buying at lower costs. If you're a seller, you're selling at higher costs. That would be the upside. So either your costs are lower or your revenue is higher. At the same time, there's the opposite risk that you could go in and prices are you need to purchase and prices are higher than you expect. You are a seller and prices are lower than you expect. So you're just exposed, but you're exposed in both directions. And just to emphasize the market design point again, how what your exposure is depends on the market design, and then also how you choose to participate in the market. We understand that in SPP, they've made specific arrangements for some of the federal deals out of WAPA, where they basically get to say, we want to be out of the market. We don't want to be cost exposed. And so, that could be something if a market formed in the Northwest, if that was of interest, something that could be worked, is that part of the market design that you would want in order to shelter yourself from some of this risk, but then at the same time, you're sheltering yourself from both the upside and the downside. So there's just a lot of things to weigh. I probably said a little bit more than just what's in that bullet, but those are some of the risk perspectives that we're trying to capture there. Okay. And I think we've hit on this slide, everything in this slide. I'll just mention, we kind of think of it, at least I've been thinking of it as, a step stool. The energy imbalance is real time. Again, I mentioned Mike's gravy analogy. It's, it's looking at what's online, what generation is available in real time, what's the best way to dispatch it. So you're only making incremental changes. If you look at the day ahead, there you're actually, a day in advance, making the most optimal schedule or most optimal plan of what will be dispatched as you can, which will change what's available in real time, right? If you take some of the more expensive gas, or, if you take some of the peakers out, or if you take resources offline because you don't expect to need them in the day ahead, it changes what's available. So there's a little bit more risk there. That's what this what's committed is getting to there. And then, the next step stool, the RTO, is really everything's in there. And Mike, maybe I'll have you do your full gravy analogy, because I probably didn't do it justice.
No, yeah, this, in terms of the way I think about the EIM, and Lauren and I have discussed it, we call it gravy because it is, essentially access to a new marketplace which hasn't traditionally existed in the West outside of CAISO. So all of a sudden now, if you're somebody like Bonneville, you can do within hour trading that you couldn't do. So it's essentially a new smallish to medium-sized revenue stream. But when we start talking about day-ahead markets and RTOs, at that point, you're not talking about a small incremental market opportunity. You're really talking about replacing the bulk of your transactions. So that's just the way we've been thinking about it, is like a small incremental market opportunity, which is gravy, versus what is the full course, and what is the meal that you're already sustaining on.
Thanks for indulging me, Mike.
Yeah.
Okay, and then I think we've talked through, this was meant to capture the consideration for BPA's participation, and I think we've hit on all these bullets. You can see here we highlighted the BPA rates again, because we think that the rate design that is especially for somebody like Jefferson, that's really important in how you experience the BPA's EIM participation. So we did hear last time, I think you mentioned that there were some questions about the wheeling issue and maybe about CAISO in general. So we wanted to provide a little bit of info on that. And I think we've talked a fair amount about CAISO, again, it's the California Independent System Operator. Within the BA, it is a full-blown RTO. So they offer all of those different, the grid, they're the grid operator, the planner, they administer the day-ahead market and the real-time market. Outside of the footprint, they're really just offering and administering the real-time or the EIM market. One of the things that we've talked quite a bit about at the executive committee meetings is some of the governance that and some of the challenges there within the CAISO. So the CAISO is founded as a California benefit corporation, and it is specifically founded for the benefit of California ratepayers. That can be very challenging for an independent operator that is tied to the benefits of a specific group of folks participating in the market. In the EIM, like back to the gravy, it's not a ton of transactions, not a ton of risk, but that concern about this foundational obligation that CAISO has, it grows as you move through and step up to that full 3-course meal. So the CAISO Board of Governors is the independent body that oversees CAISO activities, and those governors are appointed by the governor of California, and they can delegate authority to other entities, but the ability to do so is limited. They must be able to revoke that delegation. So we have the little schematic here that shows the CAISO Board of Governors. They have delegated authority to the EIM governing body. So on a lot of issues that PPC has been engaged on and working on related to the EIM governing body makes the decision about what happens in that initiative. And I use air quotes, they are making the decision, but at the same time, the CAISO Board of Governors can basically veto any decision. And that is something that they have to be able to do per their legal requirements. So PPC, as part of the EIM governance review that was going on, this has been an initiative that has been underway, I think, for 2 years. We asked CAISO a series of questions around their interpretation of their requirements under California law, and the responses we got back were very informative and did really say there can be delegated authority, but it has to be able to be revoked. So there's been some improvements to the EIM governance that create a little bit more durability for the delegation of authority to the EIM governing body. Issues will now be decided by the EIM governing body and the CAISO Board of Governors together for issues that are related to the EIM. That's going to be interesting, and the idea behind that is that there should be some good cross more discussion, more both of those bodies working together. It seems like that's going to be a positive change there. But we did just want to highlight this because it is an interesting challenge that's really important to understand as we talk about what are the options for changing governance, or what are some of the risks around a CAISO operated market. With that background, I'll hand it over to Mike to walk through some of the recap and the why behind our concern with the wheeling proposal that recently went through CAISO.
Sure. So as Lauren mentioned earlier, last summer, CAISO implemented controlled blackouts, and I believe it was the first time since the California energy crisis. And understandably, after that happened, they fast-tracked an initiative that considered a whole range of changes to their market in order to prevent that from occurring this summer. Most of the changes were pretty uncontroversial, but one of them fundamentally changed the ability to use the CAISO transmission system. And this is particularly important in the West Coast because there is a significant amount of interregional trade between essentially the Pacific Northwest through California to the Desert Southwest, or vice versa. And the proposal created significant concerns across many stakeholders in WEC because it essentially limited regional trade unless CAISO was a counterparty. And that's a pretty big deviation from the norms of transmission access. And especially in the Desert Southwest, they're heavily reliant on things like Pacific Northwest supply, particularly during short-term heat events, or if they have a generation unit that trips out, they want to be able to go to the market and buy this energy to serve their load. And that's not just limited to the Desert Southwest. It impacts the Pacific Northwest as well, from the perspective as a potential seller to the Southwest, and as, the occasional purchaser during heat events. This is something we traditionally haven't seen a lot in the past, but going through this summer with the recent coal retirements, we're seeing transmission going into the Pacific, or energy flowing into the Pacific Northwest. So if CAISO is going to essentially sit in the middle and determine that everybody flows after their load is met, that's obviously of significant concern. So CAISO's proposal, I listed the FERC docket there if anybody wants to read several hundred pages of testimony on this, was protested by, I think it was over 20 entities across WEC. It included IOUs. We submitted a protest, Bonneville, PowerX, the regional marketing entity of BC Hydro, as well as regulators, particularly in the Southwest, but other regions as well. Even WAPA weighed in. So it was a highly protested proposal. And what actually ended up happening, which was particularly concerning to us, was that FERC sided with CAISO on virtually all counts and approved the proposal essentially on the merits of the proposal. So CAISO has included language where the proposal will go away after a year, but given the complexity of this topic and the contentiousness, it's basically become the status quo now, where next year when there isn't something in place, they'll essentially default back to this. Lauren, can you go to the next slide, please? So this ruling from FERC, I think, was particularly surprising, not just to PPC, but to several entities. We've always recognized that CAISO has got a lot of leeway with FERC, but the ruling was generally surprising, one, because of the amount of opposition to it, and I truly believe that the law was on our side on this case. We've been watching this play out further. The Arizona utilities are preparing to file for rehearing with FERC, or they have filed for rehearing with FERC, as well as the Arizona Corporation Commission. They have been particularly engaged on this issue. I've included here a couple of quotes from the chairwoman of the ACC that I think speak volumes about how this has impacted their relationship with CAISO and their perspectives on further regionalization of a CAISO organized market or a CAISO managed market. I mean, she basically comes out and says that this is market manipulation, and then she further questions how expanding Arizona's participation in the regional market will benefit Arizonians. So it's a very pointed and direct statement that I'm not used to seeing in these kind of forums and fields. So this is why this is important is kind of twofold. Is one, it creates economic and reliability impacts to entities outside of CAISO. So that's obviously the most major concern. And the second is it appears like it is already having implications for how markets beyond the EIM are developed in the West. So PPC's kind of key takeaway on this is that FERC, courts, or even governance may not prevent inequitable market policy changes, but it is illuminating to understand, one, how FERC came down on this, and two, how CAISO essentially reacted when they were put into a very difficult position between favoring their own load or doing something that is more equitable and consistent with the way the rest of the West transacts. So to us, this is concerning because it goes to the entire independence question that Lauren had raised, where if I'm thinking about like sitting around a group with my friends playing a game, if one of the participants is also changing the rules, you would hope that they're doing it independently and not in the favor of their participant side. So we're still, continuing to monitor the fallout from this, and especially the operational impacts as we go through the heat this week. But I just wanted to flag this as kind of one of those things that is raising flags about a CAISO managed market, not just in the Northwest, but across the West.
And I would just, thanks, Mike. I think it's a great overview from both of you. And I want to make sure that one of the takeaways today is, again, I think we try our hardest to really stay adhered to our philosophies and principles about any kind of a market design. We don't get caught up in a popularity contest of, a state, having it or any kind of market proposal being a new shiny object. I just want to make sure you all know for sure we will stay adhered to that approach of it's not the who, it's the what, and we need to make sure that the what delivers on the value prospect and the risk, appropriate levels of risk, I think, as Lauren outlined. But I just wanted to make sure you heard that directly from us, because there are some who love CAISO and want us to run as fast as we can toward it and embrace it fully in every manner, and there are others who say lock the door. And so I would say for us, it's really kind of that middle zone of doing the proper prudency steps around whether it's California, whether it's some other market concept, as we talked about a little bit earlier. I just want to make sure you guys know that, because that's very important to us, especially when people start to have their own narrative or a storyline that gets carried in the region.
Yes.
Hand up. Yeah.
Yep.
Thanks. So if CAISO is able to exercise this ability, it's likely going to happen during peaking events, I would imagine. So I guess as the layperson that might be listening to this discussion, their question is going to be whether they're in, I think the desert Southwest would be more impacted maybe than the Northwest, depending on water situation and that sort of thing. But am I going to experience a blackout now because California is not going to allow themselves to have a blackout? I think that's the layperson's question to this. Is there some validity to that?
I think in the Southwest, that is a very valid concern. I think at least this year in the Pacific Northwest, the chances of that are much more limited, even though the water year is below average. We have tools up here that the Southwest doesn't necessarily have. I think in a very bad water year, this does create that concern. But of course, if we have a very bad water year up here, that means California is also in a world of hurt. So at least this summer, I would say the impacts to the Northwest are going to be mostly economic. in the Southwest, different story. I think this could actually, this is the place where CAISO is choosing to black out another state over themselves.
But Mike, and I think I totally agree with you, just to put a finer point on it, do you think though, with some of the, for instance, CETA dictated operating limits on certain natural gas units, as well as just an overall march toward retirements of more coal and natural gas resources in the West and Northwest, if you were to sort of pair those trends together, along with potentially a really bad water year, and you're saying a plant, let's just say a plant has been shuttered and there's no stockpile of coal sitting out front, or there's no connection to the gas line, we could see this scenario continue to potentially worsen from a reliability standpoint for the West or Northwest, looking out in a longer time trajectory.
Yeah, especially as, you know, the continued retirements of thermal generation. And Scott mentioned like outages. What comes to mind immediately is it was a winter event, but in March 2019, we essentially lost all the thermal generation on one of the gas pipelines in the Northwest. So you lost thousands of megawatts of generation. And in events like that, this proposal is absolutely concerning.
And Mike, if you were to look at impacts of this proposal, is it limited to times where CAISO is actually curtailing and making cuts consistent with this proposal?
No, that's kind of the tricky part of this too, is just the threat of being curtailed, or when I say curtailed, is trying to buy out of the Southwest or trying to buy out of California, and not being able to know that that energy is going to be there on a firm basis when you actually get to the operating hour, or, you know, the 15-minute interval, is concerning enough that we're hearing that it's pushing entities like Bonneville into buying, you know, much more expensive energy that they know they can rely on. So even if it's not enacted, we're seeing, at least right now, economic impacts of this proposal.
And Mike, you have on here next steps. You mentioned what some other folks are doing as far as the current proposal, but there are ongoing discussions. You mentioned the sunset clause, or the, you know, this will be in place until next year. CAISO is working with stakeholders on what happens after that right now, correct?
Yeah. So they just launched a new stakeholder initiative. It's been kind of split into two tracks. They are looking at some near-term adjustments that they might be able to get in for next summer. I think some of those might make modest improvements, but they're not changing the core of the existing policy that FERC approved. And the more important would be the longer-term approach for entities to essentially get transmission access across California. So it's going to be a long, complicated, and probably very contentious process, and it's going to impact all sorts of different CAISO market elements that currently exist. So I think they're at least realistically understanding that this is going to be a significant lift. And at this point, it's really too early for me to have a strong opinion on how that will go. But I think there's just general acknowledgement that it's going to be a very difficult issue to work through.
So certainly more to come here. And I think Mike mentioned that he's monitoring this week with all the hot weather. So it'll be interesting to see what happens.
Just a time check, Lauren, we're at a half hour left.
Okay, sounds great. Thanks. Okay, so next, and that's sort of perfect, I think, because now we plan to go and do a little bit of a deep dive into the EIM and BPA's participation. I think a lot of this we've already covered in our earlier discussion, but we'll just walk through. I think there's a few more things here that we want to dive into as far as how BPA plans to participate. So we've already talked about a lot about the energy imbalance market, the EIM, and we had some conversation about the balancing authority areas staying separate. This map here shows that those are all the participating balancing authority areas. at least this is actually maybe a little bit dated as far as people who have announced that they're going in. And certainly those that have planned entry in 2020 are already in, and those planning entry in 2021 actually already in too. So let's see, let me just double check. One of the things that has been a focal point of discussion with BPA, and I think it was Commissioner Topper that mentioned the exit provisions in BPA's EIM participation. The EIM is voluntary, so it's voluntary on a couple different in a couple different time frames. It's voluntary from you can choose to be a participant, long term, be part of the EIM, be an EIM entity, and then you can choose to not. Also, hour to hour, you can choose how much transmission, how much generation is available to the market. So that is a lot of flexibility and really allows participants to retain a lot of control of their resources and transmission. That is not the case if you go into like a full RTO. Once you're in, if you're in the footprint, you are required to participate, and then your facilities are required to participate as well. Now we talked a little bit about there's some different mechanisms and different ways that there might be to carve out and reduce risk for those that are participating, but it's not like the EIM where you can say, my resources are in this hour, you can dispatch 100 megawatts out of the 1,000 that I have available, because you not only get to choose whether your resources are in, you get to choose how much of the resources in. Lots of control in the EIM that doesn't exist in if you were to go to a full RTO. And there has been a lot of discussion with BPA on that, a lot of discussion about how would BPA choose to separate from the market, and those will be ongoing discussions, I think, as far as just better understanding what BPA's criteria is for continuing to participate in the market. I think we've already talked a lot about this too, but this is a sort of a helpful diagram. We talked before about the diversity of the footprint. This is actually something taken from a BPA EIM 101, which actually has a lot. This presentation has quite a few good diagrams and resources. So let us know if you are interested in the link for that. But this is a helpful diagram that just sort of shows, separate, everybody is meeting their own needs. But then when you get into the market, you can take advantage of that diversity by sharing resources across different balancing authority areas. So what does participation in the EIM look like? One of the things we wanted to call out with this slide is that there's lots of different, we call it participation, but there's actually different levels or ways that entities might be impacted in participation. Often when we're talking about choosing to participate in the EIM, and when we talk about, look at this slide and who's captured here, those are the EIM entities. Those are the balancing authority areas that are choosing to participate in the market. But there could also be other participants, so entities that are within these balancing authority areas that own their own resources, that participate from a resource owner perspective. So they can, this might be like an independent power producer that just owns whether it's a wind plant or some other sort of generating facility that they offer that resource into the market to participate. It could also be, this is the same for load serving entities. There's many BPA customers that own their own resources that could participate in the market through this perspective. And BPA actually participates both as an EIM entity and as a resource owner. We also wanted to highlight that within the balancing authority area, there are non-participating resources. So there are, again, since the EIM is voluntary, within that footprint, there can be resources that just say, no, I don't want to be dispatched by the EIM. I am going to set my schedule and I just want to stick to that. And that under the EIM, that's definitely allowed. So entities or resources within the EIM footprint have an option about whether they participate or not. And we wanted to capture here load because and this would be, the situation that Jefferson is in. You don't necessarily get to choose. Once BPA makes its decision, you don't get to choose if you're in the market or out of the market. You're exposed through BPA's participation. For Jefferson, that happens. All of those costs will be lumped into your power costs through BPA. But for other entities, like load that would be in any of the participating balancing authority areas, they might be exposed through, imbalance charges, which joining the EIM changes the way that the costs associated with that for many entities, the way that losses are charged. It changes how all of those things happen. But again, for, like Jefferson, all of that would be coming through your charge from BPA Power Services. So where are we at in talking about BPA's participation? Well, actually, from the first time we visited you all, and now we've switched gears. So we were waiting for the rate case and the tariff case to wrap up, and we were in the fourth phase shown on this little diagram here. And now we are in the closeout phase. So BPA has issued a draft closeout letter, which proposes that they will go forward with participation in March 2022 as planned. We will respond to that letter. At last week's executive committee meeting, we got guidance to respond with a risk mitigation package where we're asking BPA to commit to specific commitments that would reduce the risk for BPA's customers, for PPC members, as part of their participation. And the things that we've asked for commitments around have to do with transparency about BPA's participation, accountability, being responsible for success, defining success in the EIM and performing to those expectations. As well as we've hit on this several times, but getting those benefits from the EIM participation into rates. So those are the types of things that we're planning on responding to BPA's closeout letter with. And BPA will make its final decision in September here. I think it's, unless there is something very unexpected that happens in the next month, they will be going forward and going live in the EIM in March of 2022. So the potential impacts to power rates, this is the area, again, I think we've talked about this quite a bit, but it is really important, especially for like Jefferson, to understand how the benefits are coming through your rates. And I hit on this earlier that in 22, there is assumed no net benefits. The benefits are assumed just to offset the costs. That is despite BPA's business case, the analysis that they used to make their decision to join the EIM, showing that there was between 29 and 34 million annually in net benefits. Now, we understand that their first years in the EIM are probably not going to meet their what was shown in that analysis. There's a lot of things BPA has pointed out that they're just coming up to speed, learning how to participate, things like that. That's all understandable. At the same time, the agency, we did in the rate case really push on this issue and say, Mike wrote some great testimony saying, use this as a starting point. This is what your business case is built off of. Use this as a starting point and back off. It's appropriate to discount. That's what you should do. BPA staff did not. They stuck really strongly to the zero net benefits. And so the administrator actually hasn't weighed in on this issue because of the settlement. But this is an ongoing discussion, something we continue to push really hard on. I know we've been pushing from all levels too. I see Scott nodding because I know he's been calling this into question a lot as well. But this will be something that we continue to push on, and you'll be hearing about from us at the executive committee quite a bit, I think, in the coming months.
Yeah, I mean, it really just underscored from Lauren. It's been a full court press from staff, and I've been certainly talking to John at the executive level, trying to really make sure he understands where we're all coming from in public power. Really, that focus on accountability and transparency. If you set up a business case and say you're going to have a net benefit, And then you're not going to have the conversation about including it in BP 22. What's the prospect for the future? What are your accountability measures and your mechanisms? So we haven't given up yet. We're still hammering on them about some kind of a mechanism that provides that value signal back to our members, essentially the customers of Bonneville. So TBD on this, and we're still pushing. Yeah, Dan.
So as BPA gets into the EIM, obviously, like Lauren just said, it's going to be a couple years of adjustments. And obviously, when you get to BP 24, that's when you'll be able to kind of look at things and weigh, what should happen with rates on benefit pass-throughs or reserves and that sort of thing. But what is PPC's opinion for the 2028 contracts of what is likely to come out of joining the EIM and how that may affect, let's just say, Jefferson's contract in particular?
Yeah,
You want to jump in there? Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, no, I was gonna say, I think it becomes, so this is all kind of stepwise, right? So first of all, we haven't even had them enter into the EIM yet. So I would hope that, to your point, Dan, exactly how you outlined it, you start getting the experience and start understanding how they're landing in the EIM world and the other elements of the market activity that may germinate out of that. So I'd say the pathway to 2028, obviously we know that market participation is going to be a pretty significant contributing factor. I would say we don't quite yet know how that squares up to the 2028 context, but again, stepwise through these years coming, we're going to learn a lot more about their EIM participation and other market prospects. And I'll turn it over to Lauren, who can correct me if I'm wrong, but that's how I see it.
Well, and I'll see, Mike Dean might have something to add in here too. I was just going to add, it will be on this point of evolution, it will be interesting to see how the regional markets evolve approaching 2028. And, that it might be BPAs in the EIM. It might be that there's something else that has evolved there. But in general, if you stuck with a load following type of contract, the expectation would be that any benefits and risks, those would be baked into the contract as they are now. Although I think there is the potential to have some discussions about the amount of risk and the sort of what levels of exposure folks are interested in seeing in their products post 2028.
Yeah, exactly right. Some of the conversations we've been having with folks would you be interested in a different, sort of like you're thinking about your financial portfolio, right? Where you might have a higher risk exposure, but potentially more benefit. There are some of our members who are more interested in that pathway. Some who are less interested in, kind of almost like the, like a mutual fund kind of approach of a stable rate return kind of a thing. So that there are different risk thresholds, and that's why we'll actually be doing, not only in the market context, some discussions around risk tolerance and optionality, but also the 2028 context as well, because we need to understand and better flesh out what kind of pathways. We know we can't have 100 different options for folks in 2028, but there might be a chance to have some really well qualified and defined, say, handful of options for folks.
Yeah, I might just add on. This is Mike. Sorry, I was experiencing some bandwidth issues, so I'd shut off my video here, but hopefully you can hear me okay. I think the key issue for post 2028 and BPA's participation in markets is still what we talked about last time, which is that the foundational preference to the output of the federal system is still there, regardless of what market opportunities BPA might be participating in. So regardless of those, BPA has to honor its statutory obligations to provide that federal power at cost to those public utilities that request it. And especially for a load following type of customer, again, I think as Lauren said, well, the main impacts are going to be around if those participation in those markets is financially beneficial, then you could see a lower net cost. And as Scott said, how BPA is participating in markets might, whatever the structure is, might affect sort of the financial risk profile as well. But fundamentally, regardless of how BPA is buying and selling in markets, you'll still have the same right to preference output of the system. And BPA's participation in markets is more around their they're balancing purchases and sales of surplus power, or when they need to purchase power to balance their system when they're a bit short. So that'd probably be all I would add on, just really piling on both Lauren and Scott's points.
Okay, great. And we'll be short on this slide because we don't have Irene here this morning, but we did want to raise that there are some legal considerations for BPA's participation, and we have had lots of discussion with BPA about these. We talked a little bit about the autonomy piece and what is included in the EIM there. In the past, we've looked at BPA with preference. This was done very early on in the 5-phase process, looking at how preference would be honored. One of BPA's criteria was consistent with sound business principles, and I think that's one that we'll continue to monitor as BPA participates. FERC jurisdiction, there's very limited extension of FERC jurisdiction through participation in the EIM. So a lot of considerations, and these are the same considerations or same areas where we'd be making considerations if there's any steps up the step stool, or going from the gravy to the full meal. Just the analysis behind those would be quite different, and there'd be a lot higher barriers further into that. The greater and greater amount of BPA's business which is put into a organized market. And I won't talk too much about this slide because we talked quite a bit about governance earlier, but that this captures and says that the current proposal is to establish joint authority between the two bodies, which we discussed earlier. Just to hit on, I didn't say this earlier, so I'll make sure to say it now, that the EIM governing body is intended to be representative of all participants in the EIM. And right now we're pretty fortunate. There's both John Prescott and Anita Decker, who have strong Northwest public power ties on that body, which is pretty great. It's a body made up of 5 representatives. So to have 2 folks there that have great knowledge and experience in the Northwest with public power specifically, it's pretty great to have them in the room on that. But who is on this committee or on the governing body, that's determined by a nominations group, and which is made up of a bunch of different stakeholders, basically representing all of the interests across the EIM, from participants to there's environmental interests, there's consumer interests, there's you really run the gamut of all the participants there, feeding into that conversation. So I don't know if there's anything I want to add there, because we already had some good discussion on that. And then we already touched on this as well, our proposed response to the closeout letter. So we will be working on this, filing comments before the end of the month. And hopefully we'll get some commitments from BPA. As we said, we've been really pushing that. So we'll move then, once BPA goes into, they file their the final closeout letter, final phase 5 closeout letter. There's some implementation steps. They're working with customers that might have a little bit more direct impact, some things that might need to change in their business. And I think you all will probably see some outreach from BPA on changes to settlements, things that you will see in your bill once BPA goes into the EIM. That type of work will be going on between September and March. And then in March, BPA goes live. And then one of the things that we're also working with BPA on is what type of reporting and metrics will come out of their participation. So if once BPA starts to participate, you'll be seeing some analytics from PPC on what we can see and what BPA shares on that participation. We've talked quite a bit about this as well, but we wanted to make sure to flag that There's the potential for future expansions of organized markets. We've already talked about these 3 different categories, so won't belabor it too much. There's some examples at the bottom of each of these columns about, what the EIM, CAISO EIM is an example of a real-time market. We talked a little bit about the effort that had been ongoing as far as CAISO's extended day-ahead market that's now on hold. We expect that SPP is going to be kicking off discussions about a potential for a Northwest or a West-wide day-ahead market this fall. They're calling that Markets Plus. And then, RTO, we already talked about some of those examples. And then, there's the Grid West, Indigo. Those were previous attempts at organized, like a full-blown RTO in the Northwest that just didn't make it. So, and yeah, I think we've already hit this point quite hard on what happens as you move into different types of markets. This slide Mike Lynn put together, and just to pull this up, and we've talked about the different impacts from like a day ahead market versus a EIM conceptually, but this is some analysis that Mike put together that really shows the revenue impacts to BPA and the amount of BPA secondary sales that would be impacted in a day ahead versus the real, in an EIM, and to the extent it's much greater. Mike, did you want to say anything specific about this?
Not too much, other than I would say it is kind of informative because you can see that most of their sales are still in the Pacific Northwest at the Mid-Columbia markets. So the California pieces are of pretty big importance, but to date, expansion into what kind of takes place in the Northwest is just a much more important revenue stream for Bonneville's secondary sales.
So I think that's it for, thanks for going with us on that market, both an overview and a deep dive at the same time. So, and thanks for all the questions.
Yeah, I really appreciate all of you willing to tune in and listen to another chapter from us. And the one thing we didn't put up on the website is put up on the slide here is our website. So it's ppcpdx.org. So www.ppcpdx.org for any of the public facing materials that you may want to access. So any final questions folks might have?
I really appreciate you and your staff today really diving into the EIM and a couple of the things that revolve around that. Question is there a part 3 in order? Are you guys, what's your schedule going to look like moving forward? I know it's getting busier for everybody as the year goes on, because I know there's still some issues, that revolve around the Columbia River Treaty, resource adequacy, the residential exchange that, I'm sure some of our customers would be interested to hear about. The commission probably should be kept up on some of that stuff. And I know there's movement being made on the treaty and things like that. So what's the outlook moving ahead? And then Jeff has a question, you see.
Sure, absolutely. Go ahead, Jeff.
You're muted, Jeff.
I was unmuted, then muted. I think you can roll your answer to mine into what Dan was asking about other issues, treaty stuff. So I went back and I was looking at the presentation you gave to us, the slide deck on June 10th. And towards the end, you cover things about the BPA contract, the new contract, when different documents are scheduled to come out of BPA, which outline the different power contract options and so forth. So maybe you could talk about perhaps a part 3 if you guys have appetite for it and we have time.
Oh, sure. We definitely, the short answer is we always have appetite to engage with you all. And I would definitely encourage you to be, I think you are listening in on a regular basis to our monthly executive committee meetings where we're doing, we try to do as substantive of an update as we can. I think our package this time was 108 pages. So hopefully you're seeing those, but there are some developments. In fact, just the Senate infrastructure package sailing through, we've heard that it looks like there's some great amendments that did make it in from Senator Cantwell, a Democrat from Washington. So that's potentially good news. We need to learn more about that. So we're happy to come back on that and on resource adequacy, and even just we can do a deeper dive on some of the 2028 issues that you signaled along the way, and Mike can jump in with some of the more detailed aspects of how we're approaching that stepwise over the next couple of months. So what I maybe would propose is, how about we see written down some of the things you have an interest in, such as the Columbia River Treaty and resource adequacy and contracts. If there's some other things on there, we can maybe circle back in a few weeks and have another installment of discussion here. And I would say that, usually what's best is the kind of week we're in right now, where we just came out of our board meeting week. So and I know you all know that cycle well with your own board meetings. So we'd be happy to re-engage maybe in a month or 6 weeks from now, or a little bit further down the road, depending on what you have for availability.
Yeah, and I was just going to suggest, Scott, if we have a focus on post-2028 issues, that late September or probably even maybe early October timeframe might be a really good target, because I think a lot of things are going to be coming together, or just starting to come together around that time. So that might be a fruitful time if we're focused on post-2028 issues.
Yeah.
And I see you're live in October and November. So is that still everything a go there? Or will we hear
Well,
from
we
Karen
do-
if it doesn't?
We do a heavy caveat on that, just because we're following all the state and local guidelines and the CDC guidelines, just as probably you all are too. Currently, Multnomah County is asking or requesting that everybody be masked if they're indoors, and that will turn to mandatory on Friday. And a lot of the employers we're hearing in the area, such as Portland General Electric, the largest utility in Portland, is doing a no folks back in the office till January. So I would say this continues to evolve, and we're going to engage our folks in our board and see what they want to do in terms of next steps, because it may be that as much as we desire to get together in October and November in person, we may have to retrace on that, just given where things are. So we'll keep checking and talking to our trade partners in the other associations to see kind of where people are landing on that. I'd say stay tuned for October. Yeah.
Thanks for the update, Scott. So I want to thank our legal counsel, Joel Paisner, for helping facilitate this and set this all up. So appreciate that, Joel. Kevin, staff, Joel, you guys want to weigh in? We got a couple minutes left.
I just want to say thank you very much for a highly informative presentation and dialogue.
You bet.
Yeah,
That's what we aim for. Yeah, absolutely.
I'd just like to say thank you. I found this very fascinating. These are topics that really do pertain to the PUD and to the utility industry. So thank you very much. I've enjoyed today's meeting.
Absolutely. Okay.
Nothing to add on my end other than thanks as well. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay,
Absolutely.
so I guess, Scott, our people will be in touch with your people, and we'll hammer out the details. So is there anything else? Anybody want to add or anything else to say here? Again, much appreciated to PPC.
Yeah, and I would just say hats off to you all, because we're I would say we get energy from our members when they're excited or interested or curious about an issue. That's helpful to us, and hopefully we'll get some more exchange where we learn a little bit more about what's going on at Jefferson too, because we always learn from all of our members. But it really, I'd say hats off to you. There are many folks who say, well, I could ask the question, but I'm not going to bother. And I really appreciate Jefferson, both from an elected official standpoint, a staffing standpoint, and a leadership standpoint, wanting to dig in and have a good conversation with us. So thank you for that.
Well, when I listen to the 4-hour meetings and read the nearly 200-page packets, this is a lot better way to understand what's going on at those other, with those packets and with your meetings. So really, this is much appreciated.
You bet.
One thing I will commend everyone, because I did listen to your initial tutorial on original contracts and power sales, et cetera, and it's really helpful, and appreciate all the kind of basic spade work you guys are doing to help everybody along. Super helpful, and bringing BPA in on that as well.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you. Okay, we'll turn it back to Dan.
All right, so we are at high noon. So great job, everybody, getting in under the wire. And if there's nothing else for the good of the order, last call, I will go ahead and say thank you one more time and put us into adjournment. Thank you.
Thanks, commissioners.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a good
day.